this is what the very simple scripts that are used for the Lightning Network are written in, also just regular accounts. But it's an extremely simple language and an extremely limited language. There's a huge number of really important things that you cannot do with it. In Ethereum, the programming language has been made much more extensive, much more powerful. You can do a huge number of things with it, but in Ethereum, it is used in the execution part of a transaction, right? So in Bitcoin, all that a transaction does is it spends coins and it creates new coins, right? And that's all that it can do. In Ethereum, you have accounts, and these accounts can do more complicated things, right? So for example, they can spend partial balances. If you have 100 coins in an account, the account can spend 30 coins, right? Bitcoin can't do that. It actually has to spend all 100 coins and then give you back 70 coins in a new account to create that's also owned by yourself. Right? Accounts in Ethereum can store and load from an internal hard drive controlled by the account that's called storage. Ethereum contracts can make calls to talk to other accounts. So Ethereum accounts can do a lot of things, and this is all done by the code of an Ethereum contract account, right? So ELAs, controller private keys, do not have code. Contract accounts, controlled by code, and they do have code, right? So, but verification in Ethereum is actually extremely restricted, right? For verification, the only thing that can be verified in Ethereum ELA is a private key using ECDSO signatures, right? That's it. That's the only thing that you're allowed. And so the question to ask is, well, why was EVM, the Ethereum contract language, only used for the execution part of a transaction and not used for verification, right? Why can't you also write a piece of code that defines when transactions from your accounts get accepted? And I think the big reason here is that Ethereum, there's many big reasons, and I'll get to them through this presentation, because letting you have pieces of code that verify transactions is exactly what account abstraction is about. But one of the very basic ones is that Ethereum transactions can contain much more computation than Bitcoin transactions, right? In Ethereum, at the very beginning, you had pi million gas, right? 3141592. Today, the average gas per block is somewhere around 15.1 million, I think. It's you can do a huge number of storage operations, right? You can do something like 3,000 storage writes, I think 6,000 storage reads. You can do recompiles, you can do pairing verifications, you can do really crazy complicated stuff inside of an Ethereum transaction, right? Now, actually, it's a little known fact that Bitcoin does have this kind of one quadratic vulnerability, where what you do is you make a transaction that has a really huge number of inputs, and then it has to hash slightly different data that's the size of the whole transaction, but missing each input each time. So it has to make n size n hashes, and those can take a long time to verify. But they have a whole bunch of standard transaction rules and a much lower capacity limit and all those things that make that not actually a problem, right? So in the Ethereum case, in practice, transactions are big and computation is powerful. Computation can do lots of stuff. And having miners do that kind of computation before even getting paid is not reasonable, right? The thing to remember is that as a miner, you're receiving transactions from the public mempool. It's a peer-to-peer network. You did not yet spend any money by putting something in the peer-to-peer network. You only spend money if that transaction gets into a block. So what happens if you could create a transaction which requires doing 10 million gas of computation, and then at the end, oops, you can't put it into a block, right? If someone makes that kind of transaction, then it would just consume a huge amount of computing power of every node in the mempool, basically DOS the mempool, make it not work, without actually having to pay anything. And so exposing miners to this kind of risk is not reasonable, and which is why verification has to be a much simpler procedure than execution. Now, in early 2015, we actually had really wanted to move people over to multi-sig wallets, right? So this has been a topic that I've really cared about for a long time. Back in 2012, I wrote a Bitcoin magazine article, basically talking about how Bitcoin wallets, like people will just accidentally download a computer virus and poof, 25,000 Bitcoin's gone, right? For here wants to lose 25,000 Bitcoin. For here wants to get 25,000 Bitcoin. Yeah, just like imagine, you get like a little, computer program, like, or you make like a little file, you like title it funny internet meme.png.exe, and then the computer helpfully hides .exe because it thinks that extensions are bad UX. Send it to your friend, they double click it, the exe runs, and poof, you have 25,000 Bitcoin. So, in 2013, I was pretty heavily shilling multi-sig wallets on Bitcoin Magazine, and I've always been kind of disappointed that they haven't been more mainstream. And in 2015, the thinking was like, let's work really hard to make sure that users' default wallets were not what it could actually be smart contracts that have multi-sig logic. So you have 3 different keys, and you would need 2 of them to sign a transaction, right? Like the easiest thing to do, 1 key on your desktop, 1 key on your phone, 3rd key paper backup, or your friend, or some third-party service, or whatever else, right? Now, the big problem with smart contract wallets is that you would still need to keep some portion of your ETH separately in an externally owned account, right? And that ETH could be that account is where the transaction would start. It would call into your multi-sig wallet, and then it would make the multi-sig wallet do things, right? This approach has a lot of disadvantages. It's gas inefficient, keeping a small amount of ETH there, and a bigger amount of ETH here, like making sure they both get topped up. The logic is complicated. What happens if gas prices unexpectedly go very high up? You don't have any more enough ETH in your EOA anymore. But we figured, like, okay, fine, we'll just push through these difficulties, try to get multi-sigs out the door. Now, the problem was that there wasn't enough time. So, who was in Ethereum here back in 2015? Who remembers being extremely frustrated by us just not being able to get Ethereum out? Okay, see? So, eventually, lots of people were frustrated, right? And at some point, we wanted to, lots of people wanted to, ship it! And, that's, come on, launch it. There were just lots of these very ambitious plans, right, that we had in Ethereum at the beginning. We wanted to do asynchronous calls, we, wanted to add all kinds of other more complicated features. We wanted to have multiple clients. One of our devs really wanted to wait until we had multiple working clients. We actually even ended up giving that up. And the C++ client was still kind of in alpha mode when we launched. And that idea just never had enough time, right? And so Ethereum launched, and there was no practical way to have a multi-sig wallet. And the over-optimism on multi-sigs actually even backfired, right? There's this, one of the mechanism that Ethereum uses to kind of let applications know that some important event inside of a smart contract has happened is called a log, right? And the log is a log opcode. It creates an object called a receipt, and that receipt goes into a Merkle tree, which is separate from the state, and this can be easily accessed by clients. It can be verified by like clients and all those things, right? Now, the way that we designed every smart contract wallet and even ERC20 tokens is that it issues a log every time you sign. Now, ETH transfers were never logged. Why? Because, at the time when we decided this, we thought people would be using multi-sigs. The problem is almost nobody did. Almost everybody used single signature, right, like EOA wallets. And so exchanges ended up not checking logs, they ended up checking transactions. And so what actually happened is that multi-sigs have a harder time getting their deposits accepted by exchanges, right? So, a bit of an unfortunate story. And the dream of getting everybody to use actually secure wallets had to wait another year, maybe another 7 years. So the first part of the journey here is EIP 86, right? This was the very first attempted EIP that would try to do account abstraction. It was for Metropolis, which was meant to be the hard fork after Homestead, so the second hard fork after lunch. That ended up not happening. But the basic idea is that it's this a small change where if the signature of a transaction is set to 0, then the and then there was also another feature that was added where you could have what's called counterfactual smart contract addresses, right? Basically, the way that this worked is you could have an address where that address is calculated as the hash of the piece of code that would go into that address when it gets created. Now, why is this important, right? The reason why this is important is because it's really important for UX purposes for it to be possible to generate an address where that address has the property that there's only one piece of code that can go into that address, and that piece of code can definitely go into that address, and no other code can go into that address. Now, why, right? Basically because it's like, how do you receive your first transaction, right? Like, let's say you join Ethereum for the first time, right? And let's say that somebody wants to send you 1 ETH because they're feeling nice and it's your lucky day that day, right? How do you do that? Well, you have to like give them an address, right? And with EOAs, they can send you that 1 ETH and you're fine. But what if you're using a smart contract wallet? The problem is, if you want to act like, before you have that 1 ETH, like before you've actually interacted with the Ethereum ecosystem and received any payments, you don't actually have a way to put smart contracts on chain, right? Like you don't have the ability to do anything. And so all you can do is you can do off-chain computation, right? And if you do off-chain computation, generate an address, and then give someone that address, like if you could try to generate the address that you will have when you can create that account. But then, like, that account actually has to be locked to that particular piece of code, right? Because otherwise, like, someone else can swoop in and they can say, haha, I'm putting in my private keys instead. And, you don't want them to be able to do that, right? So having a version of the create opcode where the address actually is the hash of the code, is super important. So these were the two big things that we wanted to put into EIP86. Now, the big challenge with account abstraction is not actually the consensus side, it's actually the miner strategy side, right? Like how do miners behave if they want to safely decide which transactions to accept and which transactions to reject. So the initial thinking here was that there were 3 different ideas, right? One of these ideas is to have a whitelist of code hashes, right? So there would be a list of code hashes of accounts that we would accept. And this could be the code hashes for multi-sig wallets, single signature wallets, some extra, signature algorithms, one post quantum proof signature algorithm. You could select a list of options that we know are safe. And then miners would just have a whitelist. And you can expand that whitelist over time without hard forks. Miners could expand the whitelist even independently. And miners would accept transactions going to accounts that pass that whitelist, and accounts that are in that whitelist would have the property that they're known to actually pay the miner before doing anything else, right? So that's strategy 1. Strategy 2 is basically to stick to small transactions, right? To process transactions that ask for, let's say, less than 250,000 gas. Right? Now, this really constrains the kind of things that you could use Ethereum for, right? So like if the limit actually was 250,000 gas, then Tornado Cash would not work, Starkware would not work, publishing your own contract would not work, unless there was an exception for the gas that was used to publish the contract. A lot of things would not work, right? Big transactions have value. And so, like these 2 ideas, they were not extremely nice, and even still, it ended up missing a lot of things, right? So problems with early AA, right? So one is this issue that I mentioned, that counterfactual addresses, right? If you're going to send me 1 ETH, then basically I have to first ask you to create my account for me and then send that 1 ETH to that account, right? Confusing workflow. It requires complex logic inside the accounts to handle payments and refunds, right? So the contract itself has to have logic that says, step 1, compute the signature hash by taking the call data, taking out the signature, hashing it. Step 2, check the signature. Step 3, check the nonce. If the nonce is correct, increment the nonce. Step 4, pay the person who pay the miner. Then step 5, do the thing that the account was supposed to do, like either call into another account, or if he wants to do multiple operations, then you'd actually have to do a call into yourself, and then inside of that call you'd have to do other things, so that if whatever logic you're doing internally ends up breaking, it only breaks the inner call, it doesn't break the outer call. And then finally at the end, you have to do some extra accounting and figure out how much gas you have not spent and then get that gas refunded, right? So account logic actually gets pretty complex, and any code that's written could potentially have bugs, and so this is bad. Finally, transaction hashes are not unique, right? So lots of Ethereum infrastructure relies on this idea that a transaction with particular hash can only appear on a chain once, right? Etherscan relies on this, the Geth API relies on this, or the Ethereum API, lots of infrastructure totally relies on this, right? And early AA basically has this problem that it lets the user specify so much that if the user wanted to, they could, for example, make an account where the nonce resets every 24 hours. And if you do that, then, well, guess what? The transactions that were sent 24 hours ago can be replayed, and you could basically have a transaction happen every day that has the exact same hash, right? So this breaks a bunch of UI features. One big problem that we actually did not properly appreciate even now is, and this is probably the big problem, this is half the reason why AA has to be hard, right? Multi-validation. Basically, imagine on-chain, you have an object on the left. That object is called S, and it contains a storage value. It starts off at 0. Now imagine you have an account, and the logic of the account says, when it accepts a transaction, it does a bunch of computation, and then after that computation, it checks whether or not the value stored inside of S is 0. If it is not, then the transaction fails. And if yes, then the transaction passes. Now, imagine you have 1,000 accounts that are all like this, that have the exact same rules. Now, imagine transactions like this get into the mempool. The miners would check these transactions. They all individually look like they can get in, right? And so the all individual caps, they all individually get broadcasted. And then, whoever sends those transactions suddenly sends in a quick transaction, very higher gas price, only 30,000 gas, where all that it does is it calls into S and it sets the value in S to 1. Suddenly, one tiny transaction is able to invalidate an unlimited number of big transactions. Even if the verification process has a tight gas limit, so instead of 2 million, it might be 200,000, even then, this is a really huge amount of work that you're imposing on the entire network for ultimately a very small cost that you actually have to pay, right? Now, let's get to 2017. Who here remembers 2017? Who here remembers, the digital kitties? This was this is good. This is before we had the monkeys. The kitties were cool, right? yeah. Can we retcon the kitties into actually being the honorable one before people started the stupid monkey stuff? Okay. So in 2017, lots of Ethereum research started happening, right? And this was also the time when Casper FG was being worked on, a lot of big progress on proof of stake, a lot of progress on sharding. Some of the earliest data availability sampling work actually happened here. So first, these is a bunch of account extraction ideas that were being worked on at the time. So one, remove nonce abstraction. So basically, force the nonce to still be done in the protocol and incremented in the protocol. If you do that, then that removes the whole multi-hash thing. It basically forces every transaction to have a unique hash. Standardize the signature scheme, basically take a bunch of the work involved in calculating the signature hash and verifying the signature and sort of put it up into the protocol to make wallet code smaller. Add a breakpoint opcode. So this is a really subtle point, right? But basically the idea here is that we add this opcode called breakpoint such that if execution gets past the breakpoint and then something breaks after the breakpoint, it doesn't revert everything. It only reverts back to the breakpoint. Now, why do we need to do this? Well, before the breakpoint, you put verification, and then you pay the miner. After the breakpoint, you can put whatever. And if the whatever breaks, it only goes back to the breakpoint, and so the miner still gets paid. Right? So it makes it much more flexible to have like different kinds of templates. Other ideas. Salt and code in a transaction. So the idea here is basically that you could have a transaction that performs the task of creating an account and calling from that account at the same time. Right? So this whole problem of like what does an account extraction user do during their first transaction just kind of gets solved automatically within the protocol. And if it's their first transaction, then the account gets created. If it's a later transaction, it already exists, so that's fine. Then a newly created account pays, right? So if you do the salt and code thing, then the account that actually gets created, that's the account whose ETH is actually used to pay for gas, right? And so if you have that, then, well, when I'm receiving my 1 ETH for the first time, like, I don't need someone else to pay for gas for me, right? It just gets paid directly from my account. And then there's a softcode called pay gas, which would basically cover the entire gas payment procedure. So the initial payments, doing the whole logic of like the base fee, the priority fee, but also keeping track of the gas used and doing the refunds at the end. Everything would get put into one opcode, right? Having a gas price opcode, we ended up actually doing that. So a lot of different ideas, right? The primary goals: 1, handle the account creation problem; 2, reduce the verification complexity, reduce the complexity of the account code, deal with the problem of hash non-uniqueness, but there has been not yet any thinking on dealing with multi-invalidation. So, 2018, so verification time access restriction, right? This was this very first post. I believe this went to ETH Research, and basically this is where we finally had some kind of solution to multi-validation. And the solution was kind of copied from this idea called access lists that we invented as a way to try to make the EVM more parallelizable. But in this case, the basic idea is the verification part of a transaction would not be allowed to access any account except for that account itself, right? So you could access your own storage, you cannot access other people's storage. Now, what is the goal of this? The goal of this is to allow, or make sure that a transaction from account X can only be invalidated by another successful transaction from account X, right? So you cannot multi-invalidate. One transaction getting in can only invalidate other stuff from that same account. So that seems to fix it. Now, somehow we skipped over to 2020, right? And there was this like period of like 2020 minus 2018. I'm not good at math. Anyone here have the answer there? How many years? Okay, right, it's 5. So 5 years, right? Where basically I think developers were just busy working on getting the proof of stake out, agreeing on like how to do the merge, agreeing on a whole bunch of these other details, starting to think through sharding, doing a whole bunch of cleanup hard forks. There was just, given all of that other stuff going on, not that much appetite for like going in and doing crazy stuff. And at the same time, on the research side, it felt like there were still these ideas that were floating around that did not really solidify enough. By 2020, the ideas did solidify enough, and they came together in this lovely proposal called EIP 2938, the contents of which basically are an actually sensible combination of all of this stuff. So the pros of 2938 are it solves the problems. The cons are it's very complex at the protocol layer. At the time when, still for another 2 years, developers will be working hard on the merge. September 13th, 2020, another 2 years actually, exactly 2 years. Now, at the time, there were also these independently built account abstraction projects, right? So, Gas Station Network was this wonderful effort where basically you would send over some like operation that you wanted, like some call that you wanted to make, and you would provide a bounty, and there would be this network of relayers where any of those relayers could claim the bounty by putting your, that call, into wrapping it in a transaction and actually making the call. Now, this is a good effort, and something very similar was done by Arch and Wallet, which was, the team very early on, doing account abstraction before account abstraction was cool. And this kind of works, right? But the two biggest problems are, one is, it's these are not really enough of an open market, right? In that, there were links to, basically to use these things, you had to, call into a specific place, right? Whereas what we really want is for it to be okay for someone to rely on at, really the base level, is you want to have, a peer-to-peer network where people can just send things off in the peer-to-peer network, and then anyone can go and join as a relayer and grab a thing and collect the reward, right? So basically these things all work with wrapper transactions. There was also another goal that was introduced, the goal of making it possible to pay transaction fees with ERC20 tokens, right? So if you instead of receiving 1 ETH for the first time, you receive 1,000 USDC for the first time, well, you have no ETH, right? But you want to be able to spend your USDC, and so you would be able to actually pay your gas by spending some extra USDC and having it be converted into ETH in real time. This is a new goal, right? This is not part of the original goal set of account abstraction, but it seemed worthwhile to try to do it, and it kind of entered the scene as some of the things that people are working on. The problems was, aside from not being enough of an open market, it's also a high per operation overhead, right? You have to have this 21,000 gas plus a bunch of extra gas wrapper for every single operation that you're doing. EIP 3074 was this different thing that some people sort of thought of as being account abstraction. I did not really think of it as being account abstraction because it was working on different problems. But the good news is today, modern account abstraction actually tries to cover both the ideas of early account abstraction and the goals that people were going after with 3074. So even there, the efforts kind of merged and everyone became happy friends, which is good. So different goals. Basically, sponsored transactions, people being able to pay on behalf of other people, application developers being able to pay on behalf of their users, and being able to pay with ERC20s. And another big one is multiple actions per transaction, right? So one example of this is, who here has traded ERC20s on Uniswap? Good. So who here remembers that experience where first you have to make a transaction to unlock the token, and then you have to send a separate transaction to actually do the trade. Who here remembers giving Uniswap an allowance of infinity just so you don't have to do that over and over again? Who here has given an allowance of infinity to something and then been rug-pulled by that thing? It has happened, right? So this is now who here has done all of this in the dark old days before EIP 1559, when transactions would often take 5 minutes or longer to get on chain, and so you'd have to wait 5+ minutes to finish the whole thing. Good. See, that last problem with 1559 and with the merge reducing variance of block size has fortunately been actually fixed, right? But the other problems are still there. So that's that aspect of UX, letting people do many operations within one transaction, is also super important. Now, ta-da, 2021, ERC 4337. There is an ongoing holy war about whether or not ERCs are EIPs. My personal opinion is that it would be better if they were 2 separate categories, but other people have their own opinions that they would fight and die for, which is totally fine. But basically, 4337 tries to do roughly the same thing as 2938, but instead of being a protocol feature, it does it using 0 Ethereum protocol changes all on higher layers, right? So the basic workflow is you have a bundler, and the bundler collects many user operations from a public mempool, which is a peer-to-peer network, right? Anyone can send things into a peer-to-peer network, anyone can be a bundler, they can collect it, and then they would make a transaction that wraps all the user operations, and then the transaction would go to contract would then, first, it would call the check and pay function of each and every one of the wallets. And then, if those checks pass, it would call the executed refund function, right? So, the key innovation here is, one, this entry point contract mechanism. This idea that instead of putting every operation into a separate wrapper, you could put many operations into a single wrapper, so you only pay the 21,000 tax once, using the MBB ecosystem to create an open relayer market, right? So block builders could be bundlers. And then finally, this like really interesting workflow where first you verify all the transactions and then you execute all the transactions, right? And this just makes it harder for execution to interfere with verification and like basically makes the whole thing safer. And then later on, we'll find out it's actually also good for signature aggregation. Two major extensions in ERC 457. One is paymasters, which is a mechanism that allows a third party to do their own custom checking, and where that custom checking would also include operations like converting USDC into ETH in real time in order to pay gas, potentially checking whether or not an adapt developer is paying on behalf of a user, but just doing all of the things that people wanted to do sponsorship for. And then extension 2 is signature aggregation, right? So aggregation, this is one of the things that I actually think is going to be pretty huge in Ethereum long term, but this is like the most basic example, right? Basically, today, every transaction has ECDSA signature in an EOA, 65 bytes, right? You have your VRS value. And that's a lot of data, right? So if you look at the top there, that's a present day transaction, and a signature is like a big part of it. And then if you do a compression, then on a signature becomes an even bigger part of it, right? And this is especially important for layer 2 protocols, because on a layer 2 protocol, computation is done off-chain. And so computation is much cheaper, but data has to go on-chain, and so data is just as expensive as before. Signatures are big. They are 65 bytes. Data is 65 gas, or 16 gas per byte. 16 times 65, 1040 gas. Oh, wait, no, it's supposed to be that math, sorry. Okay, 3084 gas, there we go. So 3084 gas, it's basic per block, or per transaction in layer 2, right? And, it's like a lot, right? If we're trying to do like thousands of transactions a second, it's kind of hard, right? So, basically, if we want rollups to be like really high scalability, we have to compress data. The problem with signatures is that they're cryptographic, so they're basically random data, and so they're basically impossible to compress on their own. But what if we have aggregation algorithms that replace the collection of signatures with one big signature that attests to all the signatures, so like the correctness of all the other signatures, right? So BLS signatures actually support this. You can take a very large number of BLS signatures, combine them, and you create one signature of the same size that can be used to verify all of the operations, and basically verify everything at the same time, right? So what this ERC 437 extension does is it lets you like actually provide aggregators, and it lets you like actually aggregate all of these operations together, right? So we get really nice efficiency gains for layer 2s, so that on layer 2s, this 437 can actually be more efficient and less costly than regular ECDSA operations. So that's kind of the history, right? It's this set of ideas that sort of move forward from being very early thinking that kind of tried to solve these problems but did not really get anywhere, and then slow improvement, lots of slow improvement over time, and it kind of got to roughly where we are today, right? And I think the good news is like we've lots of people are using smart contract wallets already, right? Like who here is using a Gnosis Safe? Or sorry, I just forgot. The trademark department is telling me I'm not allowed to call it a Gnosis Safe. It's supposed to be called a safe with a TM superscript. Who here is using a safe? Okay, so lots of people are using a safe, and I'm using a safe, right? So let's it's a big bunch. So multi-sigs are good, and more and more people are using them, which is excellent, right? But we want to get to a future where multi-sigs become easy and multi-sigs become default for users, and more account security in other ways becomes the default for users. And when the time comes to react to quantum computers, we will actually, users would individually be able to upgrade their keys to something else to be quantum safe without needing to actually replace their account, right? This was actually one of the other big reasons why we wanted to do account abstraction, so that we could have a nice, easy migration path to quantum safety that doesn't require the protocol itself to do anything when the time comes. Now, more recently, the pendulum is actually kind of swinging back toward enshrining more things, right? So, one of the reasons why we struggled with account abstraction at the very beginning is because there was this dream of making the protocol, really nice and pure, right? What we really wanted to see is we wanted to see a world where a transaction call and a contract-to-contract call would be the exact same thing, right? It's like a block would just be a top-level call, and then every transaction would also just be a top-level call. Now, the problem is that we just kept on finding all of these different ways in which that ends up being imperfect, and there just kept being lots of ways to improve things by instructing. And even in the context of ERC 4337, right, there's entry point contract risk, which is, the entry point has been audited quite a bit. It's getting increasingly heavily audited, but even still, there is the desire to try to improve efficiency, to try to reduce the gas overhead of 4337. Also, there's this anti-censorship issue, right, where Ethereum transactions being censored has been a concern. Last year or earlier this year, there was that big scare where for a short period of time, 75% of certain specific types of transactions were being censored through the builder market, though fortunately that ended up improving a lot since then. But the challenge for making the MEV market safe long-term against censorship, we've had these ideas around inclusion lists, for example, right? But inclusion lists operate on a transaction-by-transaction basis. And so to make inclusion lists actually benefit account abstraction users, the inclusion list would have to also be something that applies to account abstraction user operations in addition to EOA transactions, right? So that basically, even for that reason, account abstraction needs to be enshrined. Account abstraction needs to go on layer 2s. We need standardization, integration into existing wallets, integration into existing tech, just all kinds of integration into stuff, right? Currently I think there is this really big problem where a lot of dApps end up being, not even just EOA-centric, but MetaMask-centric, right? I remember when I was setting up my Gnosis safe for the first time, which I'm allowed to call that because back then it still was called Gnosis safe. I remember I was able to go through the flow using MetaMask, but I was not able to go through the flow using the status file. And that actually later on ended up being fixed, right? It turns out there's subtle differences between MetaMask and Status and Brave, and lots of application developers, unfortunately, end up not even doing basic checks against the wallets other than MetaMask, right? And this is just something that needs to change, and the ecosystem needs to do a better job of incentivizing to change. And account abstraction wallets, also have similar challenges, right? There are applications that try to do transaction crafting locally within their own JavaScript, and if you do that, then that ends up failing. There are some NFT applications that try to use the code being 0 as a proxy for the user being a person, and they ban contracts for participating. And this, of course, also breaks account abstraction. There's a lot of applications that don't support, ERC 1271, ERC 6492, basically things that try to extend the idea of off-chain signatures to account abstracted wallets. We also need to do a better job of extending encryption to account abstracted wallets, and that's another big one, right? There's just lots of these standardization things that need to be done, but if we do, then it does look like we're on a pretty good path to making account abstraction default in a few years, and having a much safer path to like usable, secure wallets and a whole bunch of other good things for people. So thank you.
Alright, before we start the next session, so I will play our theme song again, and please